had begun to consider the government of the United States as a mere appendage to their own affairs. And we know now that government by organized money is just as dangerous as government by organized mob. Never before in all our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
Welcome to United Front Radio, the voice of New Deal America. We're exploring the ideas that once made America great and how we can implement them again today. This is Daniela Walls, chair of the Tax Wall Street Party, and Kyle McCarthy, founding member of the United Front Against Austerity. We are demanding a set of reforms including a 1% Wall Street sales tax and nationalizing the Federal Reserve. These are solutions to protect our social safety net and create millions of jobs by rebuilding our aging infrastructure. Tonight's episode is on where Occupy Wall Street went wrong and how, knowing what we know now, we can get back on track and get results. Occupy got overrun with misguided political amateurs and amateur politics. How can we move forward with smart politics? What are smart politics? Make no mistake about it, the enemy has always been Wall Street and the banks. From Jesus Christ kicking over the money-changing tables to FDR famously saying, "Wall Street is unanimous in their hate for me and I welcome their hatred." But Occupy lacked focus on a single demand like a Wall Street sales tax. What if Occupy had stuck to one demand? They maybe could have gotten what they wanted, seen it through to the end. They could have won. A 1% Wall Street sales tax would give $40 trillion back into the American economy. What if Occupy had gotten that? But Occupy flamed out while these issues are still burning. In 2008, we had the bank bailouts, which infuriated most Americans from the left to the right. Then there was the collapse of the mortgage market and widespread unemployment. People don't realize that the Tea Party was initially born out of the bank bailouts. However, the Tea Party was quickly co-opted by right-wing foundations and billionaires like the Koch brothers who sent in their agents and operatives. Occupy was also co-opted by the left's foundations and operatives and billionaires like George Soros. It could be said that this country is caught in the middle of a shadow war between the Koch brothers on the right and George Soros on the left. When people look back, they will remember Occupy as a model of protest. I would like us to leave behind a better model for future generations, a model that is successful. I am certain that Kyle doesn't want to leave on this low note either. So how can this failure be rectified? Knowing what we know now, how can we get back on the right path? How can we make the right demands, and how can we win? And how was the traditional model of protest in Wisconsin replaced by the novel model of Occupy? And was that a good idea?
And those Wisconsin protests, I mean, I think at the peak maybe had 100,000 people in them. And the only media that was covering them, you know, you saw it on Ed Schultz. He was out there a lot. A few other people like Michael Moore. But for the most part, that was more or less silenced and not talked about very much. And then Occupy comes out, and it's the talk of the entire media.
Well, 100,000 is a giant number for a protest. Yeah. And there weren't 100,000. I mean, I don't remember the exact numbers. I'll have to look it up. But I don't remember there being 100,000 in any of these Occupy encampments. I visited several encampments around the country. I was in Oakland. I was in L.A. I was in New York. I remember there being hundreds. But that was the protest that was chosen to be covered by the media. And I think the media went out and appeared like they were against the protests, but somebody gave them the green light to cover these protests, not to dismiss them. The reason the media was given the green light, in my opinion, is because Occupy didn't have any demands. When I was a kid, I was part of mega strikes, and these were real deal strikes. My father was a pilot for Eastern Airlines. He lost his job in the 80s. He went on strike. We were on strike for 3 to 4 solid years of my childhood. Wow. A lot of my childhood was defined by being on a picket line. And we joined with 30,000 airline workers who joined with steel workers when the steel companies were getting shut down in America, and the coal miners and a bunch of other major industry workers. And we joined into mega marches that were 100,000 or more strong, and we couldn't get any media coverage.
And you look at those, like the WTO protests, the whole battle in Seattle thing in 1999, and it was sort of the same thing where they had just huge numbers of people in peaceful demonstrations. There were very constructive demands going on at the time, and what everybody remembers is that a bunch of black bloc anarchists came in and started smashing cops, or even like, to take a counterexample, the Tea Party protests. I've seen bigger school board meetings than those things, and it's all over left and right wing media, and they get 100 congressmen, or maybe not that many, but a pretty big congressional and senatorial delegation, and then, like you're saying, you turn out 100,000 people and crickets.
Right. Well, I was at some Occupy encampments that had 20 people and 20 journalists. They made it look like it was bigger than it was. If anybody, for instance myself, started talking about any real demands like a Wall Street sales tax, they quickly put the cameras on somebody else. This is an interesting anecdote. I remember my father did a campaign to organize a fundraiser to buy a New York Times ad to explain why the workers were on strike. And the New York Times told my dad, even though he had raised the money, I'm sorry, we can't put any information that would offend our other advertisers. So we couldn't get an ad anywhere. We had no media coverage. We went on mega strikes, like I had told you, with 100,000 to 200,000 people.
Yeah.
And there wasn't a single news camera there.
Yeah.
So that's the difference. That was a real strike, people fighting for their lives and their jobs. But somehow drum circles are covered, or Tea Party.
A couple of people marching down the street with a AR-15 strapped to their back. It's covered. Maybe part of it is there is this like mockingbird effect in the media that once it starts getting covered by certain outlets, then everybody else sort of follows suit. But
I don't think it's a mockingbird effect. I think it's because it's a non-threatening strike.
Yeah.
And they can sensationalize it. If you have something real out there, if you have men in uniforms walking and saying, my children are hungry, Wall Street came in and dismantled this company, we produce things speculators take, those are the people who own the media companies and are the advertisers. So Occupy Wall Street became all about police brutality. And there were operatives there from the beginning that turned the average protester away from any real demands toward things like police brutality. When somebody came out there to make a real demand, people from MoveOn.org and George Soros organizations that came and said, the real issue today is police brutality. Then when I started Occupy LA with Michael Preisner and a few people, they were working at the time for March Forward, which is a subsidiary of MoveOn.org, and MoveOn.org came in and actually said, we're running things now. And they said that the first plan on the agenda was to march, this is for the first day of Occupy LA, was to march in solidarity with Occupy New York against police brutality when the LA police were not being brutal or causing any problems anyway, because the LA police had seen the New York police on the TV. And that was a whole setup, by the way, which we should get into, because Jamie Dimon paid them to do that so that it would distract protests from the banks.
Right.
They gave the orders to brutalize the protesters so that the protest would turn into a protest about police brutality. And
not to skip ahead, but who's the darling of Occupy Wall Street right now? It's this Cecily McMillan, who was at some rowdy protest. It's unclear exactly what happened. She says the cop groped her. She elbows him in the eye and then gets arrested. And all of the energy of this, if we can call it a movement, is now focused on free Cecily, whatever the merits of her case. Once again, derivatives march on, and some chick who got caught up in a brawl, is the new hero.
Precisely. Our first day of the protest, and you can look up LA Occupy, was a protest in solidarity with New York police brutality, which MoveOn organized. They had amps and a PA that they brought, and they said, today's protest, the first day of Occupy LA, is going to be in solidarity with New York against police brutality. I said, no, we should go to Bankers Hill. And they said, no, we're going to protest City Hall. We're going to protest. I said, why are we going to protest City Hall? What's City Hall got to do with anything right now? The enemy are the banks and Wall Street. So we don't have a Wall Street, but we have a L.A. arm of Wall Street, which is a place called Bankers Hill in L.A. And the protest was originally supposed to be at Bankers Hill. And they said, no, we want it in front of City Hall.
And all it took was a PA system to make it happen. It's just, you need a well-placed person with a few resources. We've run into this issue even with, like, the Robin Hood tax group. We tried to work with them on something. Nothing against at all, like the nurses union or anyone like this, but you can see pretty quickly who the paid operatives are. And all they have to do is say, no, we're not going to march to this. This was something happening in Chicago. We're not going to march down to the Board of Trade or the Board Options Exchange or whatever. We're going to march to Congressman blah, blah, blah's office out in the middle of nowhere with tumbleweeds rolling down the street. It's so easy to misdirect and just completely diffuse energy that could be used for something constructive.
You get into who's behind the Robin Hood tax, and it's pretty ugly to me. I mean,
the group that started and continues to fund it is Oxfam International, and that's sort of like the British version of the Red Cross. It's a non-governmental organization, and you start digging into some pretty ugly areas, dealing with eugenics, dealing with the whole British imperialism apparatus, and I think we'll get into some of that today when we talk about the Fabian Society and its influence on a lot of these left-wing movements.
Well, if you look at who's behind it, you've got people like Larry Summers, Nancy Pelosi, Mark Cuban.
And these are people who have just spoken favorably in general terms about a tax on Wall Street transactions, but nonetheless, the Robin Hood tax gets the bulk of the media exposure and everything else because Oxfam is putting money into it, which effectively gives them the microphone. Right,
and the problem is that if they do raise this tax, I forgot to mention also Paul Volcker and Warren Buffett. Mm-hmm. So you have to ask yourself, what's this about? Where's the money going to go if they do raise it? And is this a way to just distract from an actual, like a concrete amount, like a 1%, to make it a small, negligible amount, allocate the money for their private charities instead of right back to the taxpayer?
Well, and once again, if they say they want to raise it for everything from climate change mitigation to AIDS relief, well, who gets the AIDS relief contract? Oxfam,
I see.
It's just, it goes right back into these NGOs who are using it for something that you can't see or touch. They're not out here saying tax Wall Street so that we can fund food stamps, or that I call it the Brer Rabbit tax because remember in the Brer Rabbit stories, he always wanted to not be thrown into the briar patch. Please don't, anything but the briar patch. And the fox throws him in there and he scampers away. It's kind of the same thing where, it's Wall Street saying, oh, please don't tax me 0.003% on derivatives. Who cares? Mm-hmm. It's inconsequential. They already pay more than that to the SEC. We're out here saying 1% on stocks, bonds, and derivatives,
which could flood trillions back into the American economy and get us out of our national debt.
Right. I think that's the main thing. Is it gets rid of this idea that we're broke and therefore we need to cut the post office and cut Social Security. Blah.
The subject of today's show is revolution distractions, and why did Occupy blow up? And finally, for the first time in our history, we named the real enemy. Mm-hmm. I knew the federal government wasn't our enemy when I was a young kid, and that Wall Street was the enemy because Wall Street was who broke apart my dad's company and sold it off for parts and liquidated it. It wasn't the federal government. And the only people that helped fight against us is my dad, and I went lobbying Congress for 3 years. I used to call it Congressing, and I'd have to sit on those cold marble floors. It's not hard to go into a congressman's office. You knock on the door and you walk in. They have actual physical offices, and some were for us and some were against us, but that was the only help we had. Yeah. Wall Street took the company and broke it up, and my dad has this always yelled, he's like, the problem with this country are the goddamn MBAs. he's like, they produce, and he would say, Daniela, they produce nothing. They produce nothing.
Yeah.
And he drilled it in my head early. He's
let's
like,
not let the lawyers off the hook here.
yeah, let's not let the lawyers. But my dad yells that too. He's like, the goddamn lawyers and the MBAs. Both of them produce nothing.
And really quick, just to interject, I mean, Wall Street is not. I think it's good that we have a term to describe financial speculators, but I think people tend to think of it just as the stock market. Wall Street is either it's just J.P. Morgan Chase or it's just, the New York Stock Exchange. I think the biggest part of Wall Street that people tend not to think about is private equity funds, hedge funds, things like the Blackstone Group or Prudential even, or these smaller hedge funds, run by like these.
Can you explain what a hedge fund is? And because most people don't even know what a hedge fund is. Seriously.
I have a hard time explaining it. I actually, early in my career, as a graphic designer, I designed a logo for a hedge fund, and I thought, oh, this is cool, a hedge fund. I never even knew how it was.
I swear to God, I know that's such a basic question, but
George Soros works through a hedge fund called, I think his is called Quantum Fund, isn't it? Hedging your bets. It's set up to take various long and short positions in the hopes that, you're going to sort of beat the odds in the average of your positions. But they're basically betting against themselves. They're betting against farmers in the commodity futures market. They're betting against national currencies.
What does that mean, they're betting against themselves?
Meaning they can take, like a long or a short position. Basically, a long position is they'll buy something at a certain price expecting that the price is going to be higher and therefore they're going to reap benefits. Mm-hmm. Whereas if they buy something and they expect the price is going to drop, then they're going to buy like an insurance derivative against their own position. So that, if they lose money on the asset, then they're making money on the bet that the asset is going to be devalued.
Okay, so even if they lose, they win, and if they win, they lose, like...
Yeah, heads I win, tails you lose. It's those things like everything from, a Bain Capital who comes in and restructures a company probably in the same way that happened to Eastern Airlines, where they come in and say, now the flights are going to be this long, we're going to cut this level of middle management, we're going to deregulate air traffic control all the way up at that level.
That's what they started out with, and then finally they just broke the workers because they couldn't work. Right. They wouldn't take it anymore, and then they shut down the airline and sold it off for parts.
Right, and it's they're able to buy low and sell high. It's disaster capitalism. It's looting, and then in the speculation part, they are not like it's not like these are guys playing poker. These are guys with a vested interest to destroy your company because they hold. It's almost like it's like having a mafioso holding a life insurance policy against you.
That makes a lot of sense. That just made it make a lot of sense to me.
I think part of it is, you can get into the whole issue of shareholder rights that people like Ralph Nader address. Then there's just there's this systemic issue of, is your economy protected against free trade, and what does that do to just the prevailing wage rates? And then there's the issue of regulation. Who owns the regulatory apparatus when you get into things like the air flight controllers and all that? Mm-hmm. I don't know. It's just a whole collection of issues about who holds power in society, and do the people have effective control of their government? So maybe let's go back into Occupy a little bit and talk about what were the demands of the people on the street versus what became the demands of the movement, and then where is this thing going today? And then maybe we can sort of circle back to put it into some historical context to show that this kind of distraction from the obvious demands of a society experiencing an economic depression have happened before.
Yeah, let's do that. I wanted to mention one point that I forgot to say a minute ago when I was talking about Eastern Airlines workers being glamorous at the time. Many of the younger people don't remember that the working man in any capacity at one point was glamorized. Working in a car factory at one point was a glamorous job in a way. You came home and you had a home, and people are proud to show pictures of their fathers. Sometimes you see their grandfathers on Facebook, where they came home and they were in their factory uniforms And when they got home, the wife came out and greeted them in clean clothes and a skirt, and the kids were perfectly dressed coming out to greet the father who had a lunch pail.
It's really interesting, and maybe we can get into a little bit of, like, sort of the cultural attacks on that idea. I mean, even getting down to Homer Simpson, they take something like a high-tech, highly skilled industrial job of power production and just turn him into this bumbling, stupid oaf.
Absolutely. Homer's a bumbling idiot. In the same way the factory worker would come home, my dad would come home from work, and my mother didn't have to work when we were young.
Mm-hmm.
I was raised by a stay-at-home mother.
It's amazing how, people, and I think young people, and maybe this gets into Occupy, have lost sight of this because they haven't seen a functioning industrial economy. My dad worked in the printing industry, and his dad worked in the printing industry. My other grandpa worked in the printing industry, and they were all, or my dad and my grandpa were sort of like industrial entrepreneurs of a sort. My other grandpa just worked on the factory floor his whole life, but it was honest work. They made a decent living. My dad was somewhat, he had a somewhat successful career coming from, his first job out of a small college was as like a night foreman at a slaughterhouse. Mm-hmm. And you just don't have to go from there to, he ended up, even his company paying for him to get an MBA at the University of Chicago. You don't see that anymore.
His company paid for him to go and do a master's?
Yeah.
Interesting.
And they still have executive MBA programs, but it's basically for people who want to fork over $50,000 in the hopes that they're going to make some connections and get into Wall Street. You just have lost this idea of the industrial corporation being almost like a family that's going to help you advance your skill set and help you become more valuable to them. It's just become, young people today have not experienced that. They missed, I think maybe, we're both in our 30s. I think our parents might have been the last generation to sort of experience what it's like to work in a New Deal economy.
Well, when you see teens, they don't have that concept. They were the latchkey kid generation where two parents were then working, and it was post-industrialization.
Right, and so now I think they are more susceptible to this idea of, maybe we can get into the article at Against Austerity about this world of pure imagination. They don't have a tangible idea for how wealth is created, for how the economy works. How does food get on your table? How does the car get there? Mm-hmm. Everybody they know is working making goddamn iPad apps or, working at Starbucks or whatever it is. They don't see the factory workers and the farmers and everyone else because they're all in China and India.
And that was the perfect choice to call your article A World of Pure Imagination. The subtitle is How Occupy Turned to Anarchy. We focus on this article on Russell Brand. In 2012, in the Summer Olympics, Russell Brand sang a song from the Willy Wonka movie. And I just want to read the lines of the song because I think it's important.
Can you sing it, please?
No. Okay. Can I sing it in a Willy Wonka? In a Willy Wonka? Can I still? Yeah.
Come with me, and you'll be in a world of pure imagination.
Oh, maybe you should finish it.
Look and you'll see into your imagination. We'll begin with a spin, traveling in the world of my creation. What we'll see will defy explanation.
I cannot believe you just did that. Come with me, and you will be in a world of pure imagination. And that's so important because we've lost sight of what's tangible. Something tangible is seen as polluting.
The idea of the article, it goes through some of what we discussed earlier about Occupy. It talks about Occupy being a rehash of something called the 1968 May Day riots in France, or the May strikes.
Okay, that's so important because most people think that Occupy was an original event and defines our generation. We're the first time there ever was an occupation. But this is nothing new. This was mimicked. This protest was mimicked after the 1968 occupations in France. So talk about that.
The connecting thread here is that those strikes, which were it was basically like it was wildcat strike, so these sort of disorganized, spontaneous striking of students and certain factory workers and stuff that tried to bring down the government of Charles de Gaulle. That was ostensibly inspired by this group called the Situationist International.
And Adbusters, who claims to have started Occupy, Adbusters on their website says that they are coming out of the...
Yeah, they're basically a rehash of this thing. It's
rehash of the Situationist International of France. Mm-hmm. Just want to make that clear.
Yeah, and in both of them, it's sort of like these avant-garde art groups who are protesting consumer culture and industrial culture itself. You know, they're not out here saying, whatever, we want the Wall Street sales tax. And actually, we can mention that. One thing that's interesting is that Adbusters, when they start advertising, right when they were advertising Occupy Wall Street, the founder, Kali Wasson, who's this sort of, he's this anarchist guy. But interestingly, he comes right out and says, "What they launch Occupy Wall Street with this poster of the ballerina on the bowl, and it says, what will our demand be?" And the idea is that Occupy is going to create a demand for the 99% or the working class, that they are going to demand some concession from the 1%. And he comes right out and says, well, maybe it's going to be the 1% Wall Street sales tax, which, the only guy I'm aware of talking about that in those terms was Webster Tarpley, so that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, they said, what is our one demand, which is a great pretext for real revolution.
Right.
But then that idea of a one demand got lost.
The loophole is the one demand must come out of this anarchist process. It's got to come from the People's Assembly. It's got to be spontaneous. Basically, we're not going to lead you. We're just going to create a poster, and then you, the unwashed masses, are going to decide what you want, which, as you said, inevitably is steered into whatever, police brutality and all this crazy stuff like the human microphone, and it just basically it just turns into chaos.
If they had suggested something like a 1% Wall Street sales tax and stuck with it, Occupy and everybody had gotten behind it and not done all this other stuff like the human mic or were afraid of being co-opted. If we had all rallied around something like a 1% Wall Street sales tax, which could put, like we said, trillions back into the economy, we could have gotten it.
And you would have had 50 Elizabeth Warrens instead of one of them.
Yes.
Just like the Tea Party has 50 Marco Rubios.
Yeah, because they had some demands. So they have 50 Marco Rubios.
And similarly, I think we should give some credit to people on the right. I think in those Tea Party protests, a lot of them were really protesting the bank bailouts.
But why didn't we all organize around nationalizing the Federal Reserve? You had some people out there with the Ron Paul agenda, which is to end the Federal Reserve. And we were saying in our last episode, and I was thinking today I wanted to go over that for 1 second. When you hear things that are unrealistic, like Dave Bratt saying jail bankers, or you hear Ron Paul saying end the Fed, you can't have a country as big as ours without a national bank.
Even if you end the Fed, you're doomed tomorrow because you have a treasury auction and nobody shows up, and then the U.S. is bankrupt.
Right. So everybody gets behind end the Fed or jail bankers. These aren't realistic things, so that allows them to say it because they know it's never going to happen. What if Ron Paul came out and said nationalize the Fed as intended in the Constitution and turn it back into a national bank and give Congress back the power to print? Mm-hmm. If he's such a constitutionalist. Now that's something that's realistic.
Right.
So when you hear things that just aren't realistic, learn to train your ears for realistic versus non-realistic. It's very realistic to nationalize our Federal Reserve. Congress was printing the money. JFK tried to turn it back into a national bank.
JFK, I don't think, did anything very formal, but it was quite clear that his intention was to go back to publicly controlled money. And, actually, the one time that the Fed was ended effectively was under Andrew Jackson. It was called the Panic of 1837, because he comes in, destroys the second national bank of the United States. Basically, it gets replaced with a bunch of local bank currency. So each bank is printing its own notes. You get this hyperinflationary panic because no one is in control. The economy just explodes, and then you literally get 4 decades of just bitter depression until the Republicans come back in to nationalize the Fed, to create a central bank.
So when our Fed was, for the periods when our Fed was nationalized, what did that do for our economy?
And it wasn't called the Fed back then, but the very first thing that the founders did, the second thing, because the first thing was they voted to recognize themselves, or say it was just some sort of a formal vote. The first substantive thing that the founders did was to create the first national bank of the United States. Mm-hmm. And the purpose of which was twofold. One was to basically rewrite the war debts. So they assumed all the debts that had been incurred by the Continental Congress, basically set a long-term schedule that they were going to be paid. They did that by creating a funded national debt. Some of it was sold to private stockholders in the U.S. and Europe, and that's not something you'd want to do today. But the rest of it was just basically the faith and credit of the people of the United States. They just created new money. They put it into the economy to say, all right, the war debts are paid off. We're going to pay all the soldiers off. We're going to pay for whatever, the reconstruction, and pay for the ammunition we used and all that kind of stuff. And we're going to rebuild that wealth and sort of refund the national debt through economic development. And they go around financing, canals and bridges and different kinds of industrial concerns and things like that. And it's just a huge blossoming of industrial production and living standards. And really, it just goes, the financial state of the U.S. goes from being just an utter basket case in 1776 to being thriving by the early 1800s. And it was kind of...
So it was major progress.
Oh, yeah. And in the same thing in the Civil War. I mean, the thing that derails the progress is when you get reactionary regimes coming into power, like Andrew Jackson, who sort of push it off track. They're either fighting against the ongoing policies of the Fed, or they, Jackson just undoes them. And it's sort of the same thing with the high watermark of the Republicans, where you had Lincoln and McKinley and all these guys. With the greenback system, it was the same basic idea. It was just this unbelievable advancement in just production and wealth and living standards. And then the whole thing gets flushed down the crapper by, at that time, it became the reactionary Democrats, because, they wanted to appeal to Wall Street.
Lincoln enforced a Wall Street sales tax to help fund the Civil War on top of using greenbacks.
I think this is a good place to bring in this idea of Fabian socialism and generally the British proliferation of these sort of false doctrines. Following the U.S. Civil War, you got to remember that there's a period where the British Empire goes from just dominating the world through its control of the ocean to being knocked back by the development of continents. And that's, you've got Lincoln with the Transcontinental Railroad, you've got Bismarck in Germany, you've got similar things happening in Russia and elsewhere, and it's really the former ability of the British to control the world and to just sort of impose colonialism on the entire world is really hurt. The slave empire is hurt. And so I think what happens is that the British sort of go into this phase where, rather than ruling by physical power, they're going to rule by ideas.
There's the point.
Around the period of like I think it's 1884, you get the Fabian Society is formed. Mm-hmm. And this involves, early on, it involves people like H.G. Wells, who is the head of British Foreign Intelligence during World War I. It involves, George Bernard Shaw.
Russell Brand is the new Fabian Society's George Bernard Shaw. There's a quote that said, "The ladies loved George Bernard Shaw. He was a good front man for the Fabian Socialists." Does that remind you of anybody? I suggest Russell Brand.
It's very interesting that the use of British intelligence, the use of these sort of men of letters or artists who are also seducers in a way, where George Bernard Shaw is one. Roald Dahl, the guy who wrote Willy Wonka, as a matter of fact, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory.
Oh, and funny that Russell Brand chose that as his song.
He's a British intelligence agent, and his purview is to come in and seduce high society ladies in New York and Washington.
You gotta bear with me here, because my mind is blown, because of course I read every Roald Dahl book when I was a kid. Man, they brainwashed me early. So, where are you getting the proof? Where are you getting the proof that Roald Dahl is a British agent?
This is public knowledge. You can Google it. Just type in Roald Dahl MI6 or Roald Dahl British Intelligence.
Okay. But they're seducers of women, which is interesting, because you wouldn't think of it to look at George Bernard Shaw. If you Google images, you'll see a man with a beard. If you look closely, you'll see that he was a handsome man. For whatever was considered handsome at that time, they have a sexual aura, or they've been sexualized by the media. There's a lot that goes into making a Russell Brand, believe me. Yeah.
Here's Roald Dahl. This is from something called Mental Floss. This is a website that it's been written about in books. Long before he wrote Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Roald Dahl was a fighter pilot for the British Royal Air Force. But blah, 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 blah. So he gets injured. He was transferred to a desk job at the British Embassy in Washington, D.C. Dahl quickly charmed his way into high society and became so popular among D.C. ladies that British intelligence came up with a whole new role for him, seducing powerful women and using them to promote Britain's interests in America. And you have a lot of the novelists that people think of even as being pro-American or somehow anti-tyranny. Ian Fleming is a British agent, the guy who wrote all the James Bond books. George Orwell is a British agent. Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World, not only a British agent, but is very, very important in this whole New Age thing that we can hopefully get into.
And when you say British agent, that's somebody basically we're saying that's just loyal to the crown.
The crown and the city of London. I mean, and if you can still think of those interests in the way that you think of British imperialism. How does the city of London is the center of world finance still to this day? I mean, maybe you could put it on the same footing as Wall Street, but they are operating on behalf of the interests of financial control of the world through speculation and cartels and colonial enterprises. People forget that the British Crown still owns Canada. It's not like
people forget how much the British Crown owns. If you go to royal.gov, okay? royal.gov.uk, this is the official website of the British monarchy. There's a search bar in the top corner. It says choose your Commonwealth realm. You click on that, it's going to show you all the countries that the British monarchy still own. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Jamaica, Antigua and Barbuda, Bahamas, Barbados, Grenada, Belize, St. Christopher. It goes on, Papua New Guinea. You don't realize how much landmass the Queen actually owns on this planet.
And before you start dismissing some of the Caribbean islands, remember that is where all the offshore finance takes place. It's not that British people run the world. It's just that a British-centered system, which used to be centered in Venice and used to be centered in Rome, and is now sort of jointly centered in Britain and New York, and Tel Aviv, and some places like that. It runs the world through these sort of covert means, through financial empires, through colonial holdings of this kind.
I got into an argument with my stepdad recently about this, and he said to me, "Oh, that's so silly to say she owns that. She doesn't actually own that much of the world. She's just a figurehead. That might be territory, but the territory is democratic. It's run by the people. She can't actually make claim to any of that land. That's still her land. She can make claim to it. I don't know."
What was just a couple of years ago that the Queen suspended the Canadian Parliament and appointed a new Prime Minister? Or was it Australia? Okay, in 1975, the Australian government shut down because of a funding issue, and Queen Elizabeth II fired everybody in the Parliament.
Am I the only nerd that you know that's obsessed with .gov websites? I'm even into .gov.uk websites.
Yeah.
Because everything's there. Royal.gov.uk is a great website. It tells you everything that's really going on. Her Majesty the Queen, early life, how much power she actually wields. They just tell you right here. It's all open.
The point is not, Queen Elizabeth is sitting at some round table telling everyone what to do. It's just that the center of power happens to be associated with the apparatus of the British Crown and British intelligence. And obviously that's not exclusive. Now you've got the CIA, you've got the Mossad, you've got, French and German intelligence. It's all over the place.
This is the week of the World Cup. The Argentinian team held a sign that says the Falklands belong to Argentina. Mm-hmm. And a really interesting thing to YouTube and Google is Falkland Islands. That was our largest air war, I think, since World War II. You don't realize that was a war for territory.
Mm-hmm. Why was Vietnam so important? Well, it's because all of Indochina, it has strategic proximity to Asia, but also because of tin and rubber and all of these strategic raw materials, and you're going to find the same interests who are cartels based in London and Amsterdam and Switzerland, and then sometimes in the U.S., who are the majority owners of all raw materials, whether you're talking about copper. Rio Tinto is a company that operates in South America that I believe is associated with, I think Rio Tinto is British. Let me look that one up. Rio Tinto is a British-Australian multinational headquartered in London.
This colonialism is still going on because this war with the Falklands started in 1982. Many people died, 649 Argentinian and 255 British military on a small island. Britain sent in an entire naval fleet and an entire air fleet.
Slavery never ended. It's going on now, and imperialism never ended. It just takes this different form of multinational corporations and globalization. The world's biggest steel company, I think I mentioned last week, is Mittal, which is based in Luxembourg, but their manufacturing is in India and Poland and Ukraine. It's just that they're able to use political control to keep a country fenced off in terms of its wages and its regulations and the ownership of its land and all this kind of stuff, and just exploit it in the same way you would exploit slaves on a cotton plantation, and then ship the low price materials to the high income countries and profit on the difference. It's the same exact thing under a different name.
Do you remember when Webster Tarpley yelled at me on the phone that you were on the call, and he said, Daniela, if you want to understand geopolitics, the best thing you can do is get a map.
Yep.
And
absolutely.
If you just look up where the Falkland Islands are on a map, you'll notice they're only a few miles off the coast of Argentina, and the water is so shallow between Argentina, the land actually sticks out and joins into the Falklands. It's just a piece of Argentina that's sticking up out of the water. It's connected to Argentina by a land bridge. They already have the islands that are in the Caribbean, right?
Yep.
So now they wanted one at the bottom of South America, near the tip by Argentina.
Why did Britain help set up Israel through the Balfour Declaration? And let's hope we're not offending too many people here, but it's basically an aircraft carrier right in the middle of oil country. You go get yourself a map of Israel, and why is Israel so interested in the West Bank? Why are they so interested in starting wars with Lebanon and in Syria? It's not because, the religious ideology sort of fuels the soldiers to get out there and fight, and fuels the money to, people to donate to save Israel or whatever. The real issue, as always, is to control the Mediterranean.
It's all strategic. All war is strategic.
Mm-hmm.
My grandfather, who was high at the United Nations, always said that to me. He said, Daniela, do you think we're in the Middle East just for oil? Do you think we care about the bottom line of some Texas oil millionaires? He said, or billionaires. He said, that has nothing to do with it. We're there. We occupy that area for strategic reasons so that China and Russia can't get their hands on certain areas.
Yep, and that's a lot of the time. It is just like...
in order to continue the Anglo-Saxon world empire. Sorry.
Yeah, you got to close a place down so you can just mothball it. Mm-hmm. And it's the same reason why, you go look at the map and look at what lies between Russia and China, what lies between China and India, what lies between, India and Iran, all of the stands and Mongolia and Nepal and Bhutan. Mm-hmm. Who cares about Bhutan? Bhutan is just a way to prevent China from transiting oil and goods between itself and India and Southeast Asia. It's just...
Exactly. And same thing with Ukraine right now.
Yeah. So maybe we're getting off track a little bit. I think the point we're trying to make is that the world is controlled through means that are not the same as they were in the 1800s or in the 1700s. It's controlled through geopolitics, it's controlled through finance, and it's controlled through cartels. And it's basically the same system as British imperialism, just under a different name.
Instead of using traditional warfare, England controls the globe through British intelligence. British intelligence shouldn't be underestimated, and there's some major players in this, like Russell Brand.
Yeah, and I mean, to take a small example, look at the situation in Ukraine, where they're able to control Ukraine through this phony nationalism as a front, and basically, they go through and they seize power, and then, but what's the effect? The average Ukrainian gets their living standard cut, the farmland gets privatized and sold off cheap, the coal interests get given away, the gas pipelines are privatized. It's just all of this for a mental construct that Ukraine is independent and we don't like, our corrupt president or whatever that is. They're basically able to just pull the wool over people's eyes and get them to cut their own throats for the sake of something that's entirely conceptual.
Well, British intelligence is hard at work in these modern revolutions, color revolutions, Occupy, wave of action, whatever's going on. Don't underestimate the fact that British intelligence has its hand in it.
Yeah, and again, we should also never forget the CIA and all these other groups, but the British are of particular interest when we're looking at Occupy and sort of the history of how this stuff comes out. We were talking a little bit about the Fabian Society, and this is named after, there is a Roman general named Fabius Maximus, and basically he was, the basic idea is that he won a war of attrition, basically just by sniping at his enemy for such a long period of time that they just demoralized and wore down the opposing army to the point where they were so weak that they could be more easily defeated. And the Fabian socialists basically said, they took the ideas of Marx and they said, okay, we're going to achieve socialism through attrition. We're just going to very gradually snipe our way into society by undermining, the capitalist system. That's what they say. But if you look at their old logo, it's a wolf with a sheep's skin draped around it, carrying the banner of socialism.
A wolf in sheep's clothing.
Yeah, and I think that the basic idea is that they are trying to wear away nationalism gradually with using phony socialist doctrine as a prelude to reinstalling imperialism. Because remember, this is after the British Empire has been defeated by Lincoln and Bismarck and Tsar Alexander, and all. The whole system is sort of crumbling apart because of resurgent nationalism in the 1860s and 70s. And so it's in the 1880s that Fabianism becomes sort of this new strategy. And so what three things that the Fabian Society
this new strategy of mind control.
Yeah, basically of the use of propaganda and specifically the use of socialist propaganda. And I think this is where a lot of sort of quote-unquote anti-New World Order people on the right, where they get all twisted up. You can look at this thing, and if you take the Fabians at their word, you think that the conspiracy is they want a world socialist dictatorship. That's not it at all. They want the British Empire. Right. But socialism is the sheep's clothing that they're going to use to try to get that.
They don't really want any form of socialism. If they were trying to oust Charles de Gaulle, they had their hand in the Situationist International of France. Mm-hmm. And steering that the same in a way that they steered Occupy, that would turn people against their government by seeing.
I guess it just all depends on what your definition of socialism is. If you think that Franklin Delano Roosevelt is a socialist, the British Empire is not about socialism, and the quote-unquote New World Order, which was a term coined by Fabian Society's H.G. Wells, again, the head of British foreign intelligence during World War I.
we don't define FDR as a socialist.
Glenn Beck would define him as a socialist.
Yeah.
And would just say that government control of the private sector is socialism.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, the words and the terms and the concepts are just getting all mixed up, and that's the whole point of this thing.
Mm-hmm. To mix people's minds up.
Yeah, just to get people chasing themselves around, and so
to get people chasing their own tail, like the snake that eats its own tail.
Yeah, and so three emanations of the early Fabians are: one, the London School of Economics, which it's very important throughout its history, but especially today with Occupy, when you're looking at who are some of their faculty members. David Graeber, who's sort of the main ideological force behind Occupy, so we're told. Mm-hmm. Naomi Klein, who writes these books against globalization and all this. So people like this, it's sort of like where the avant-garde left anarchists come out of. So that's one. Number two is this New Statesman magazine.
Just let's mention avant-garde left anarchists that come out of an anthropological background like David Graeber, who want the end of civilization as we know it and a return to tribal culture.
Right. So he's saying basically we need a low-tech society or we need a utopian society where everyone is using 3D printers and basically people are taken out of the workforce as a way to just basically, we are not going to advance centralized technologies, which would be power production, infrastructure, big industrial enterprises. Show me the 3D printer that's going to build a sewer. Or
right. Right.
You know what I mean? What are you going to do? You're going to make like a little piece of jewelry, or you're going to make a new clip for your AR-15, and that's a substitute for the auto industry and making airplanes and traveling to space. It's totally preposterous, but this is what, the big academic institution in London is turning out.
Frivolity.
So, yeah, and then there's the New Statesman, who invites Russell Brand to be its guest editor and frequent contributor.
New Statesman that's owned by the London School of Economics.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the third one that people don't know much about is called The New Age. It's a magazine that comes out right around the same period of like the very late 19th century, early 20th century. It starts as sort of a socialist publication and then is quickly taken over by George Bernard Shaw, I think is the main guy, but brings in people from H.G. Wells to Annie Besant, who's the grand dame of the New Age. She's a theosophist. She kind of takes over Rudolf Steiner's movement. Who else is involved in this? Aldous Huxley, George Orwell, the whole crew. What's his name? Aleister Crowley writes a number of things for it. It's sort of like a combination. It's actually similar to Adbusters, I would say.
I like how these things all have this prefix new. New Statesman, New World Order, New Age, New Man.
Mm-hmm. H.G. Wells, like I said, is the guy who coins the phrase New World Order. Mm-hmm. And he is a frequent contributor to the New Age magazine, which later becomes the official publication of 33rd Degree Scottish Rite Freemasonry, which some of our listeners are going to...
You're going to have to slow down and explain that one, Kyle. What? Say that.
That's a whole other episode, but suffice it to say, the New Age magazine is not just a nice little organic literary arts journal. It's the official publication of Freemasonry, which anyone who gets into the conspiracy stuff is going to draw a lot of connections with that.
Continue.
But these characters, like you said, George Bernard Shaw is a playwright. His famous play is called Pygmalion, but all of these guys get heavily into the eugenics movement. George Bernard Shaw has some just wild quotes. He's got a quote you can find on YouTube called "Justify Your Existence." He says things like, "I appeal to the chemists to discover a humane gas that will kill instantly and painlessly. I don't want to punish anyone, but there are an extraordinary number of people who I might want to kill. I think it would be a good thing to make everybody come before a properly appointed board. Sir or madam, will you be kind to justify your existence? If you're not producing as much as you consume, or perhaps a little bit more, then clearly we cannot use the big organization of our society for the purpose of keeping you alive.
These people hate humans. This has been a through line. This genocide has been a through line for so much of our history. It's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of these people. It's
and I was looking at some pictures really quickly of kids in Africa the other day, and it didn't hit me until yesterday. You had sent me a clip, and there was a picture of kids in Africa in it, and it didn't hit me till last night that I realized, how are the starving skeletal kids in Africa any different than those pictures we see of people in concentration camps?
Yeah.
The debt we're imposing on Africa is just this exact same genocide.
Well,
so these people on a larger scale. So these people are larger genocidalists than Hitler ever was.
And it's worse because the whole world knows about it. It's just sitting there watching. Mm-hmm. I think what people would say, well, what are you going to do? They're useless eaters, and they don't see the control of imperialism over the strategic resources of Africa. It's
right.
Not that the Africans are just a bunch of lazy, backward people. Americans were a bunch of lazy, backward people before they got the National Bank and before they got the Homestead Act. And,
mm-hmm.
my ancestors fled Europe from various revolutions and stuff, and were basically peasant farmers turned into farm entrepreneurs, and their kids turned into industrial entrepreneurs and so forth, because you have the government protection, because you have...
And because both of our parents had industrial jobs that could support a family, then we were allowed to pursue more intellectual areas.
Right. So, people like Shaw or like Margaret Sanger was involved with this group. Bertrand Russell, who talks about preemptive nuclear war against people we don't like. It's just a really nasty, virulent group of, they're Anglo-Saxon master race believers. Mm-hmm. They hate. It's everything you hate. It's basically proto-Nazis. Mm-hmm. And I think you'll find that the ideological thrust of Nazism comes directly out of this movement, whether you're looking at theosophy or whether you're looking at the geostrategic purpose of Nazism. And so one figure like Bertrand Russell in particular, then he gets involved in this thing called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And this is where basically British and U.S. banks are involved in funding modern art movements, philosophers, everything from like Jackson Pollock to Tennessee Williams to you name it. It was money from the CIA and MI6 pushing avant-garde art into the mainstream.
Avant-garde, much like the culture jamming of an organization like Adbusters. Can you explain the reason behind the CIA pushing avant-garde art?
Well, their reason was, we're going to win a cultural Cold War against the Soviet Union, and we're going to show that their art is backwards and it's dead. They've got a dead culture and we've got a live culture, and therefore we're superior. That's the idea. Mm-hmm. But the real idea, and I think you can see it, it's the Opium War. It's basically mainstreaming of drugs and pornography and divorce and everything that leads to the disintegration of a culture mm-hmm. by disintegrating the family, which is sort of the core unit of society.
There might have been a factor in my life as to why I never had a family or never pursued that, because I had this idea in my head of this rebellious free spirit. I had the ideas in my mind of Charles Bukowski and Jackson Pollock, these kind of rogue characters that represented to me freedom. I was heavily influenced by beat culture. And somebody like Allen Ginsberg, who was influenced by William Blake.
Blake he's hard to understand because there's a lot of symbolism and it's changing and stuff, but my take is basically that he writes these epic poems. They're almost like Kabbalistic poems about the birth of Albion represents literally the British Empire. I mean, Albion is the name of Britain. The birth of imperialism out of this bringing together of opposing forces. Mm. I kind of...
Strange that David Icke and Russell Brand are carrying on that same imagery. The new age of the British Empire.
Or they might say, well, they might explain it in the same way that you would have been attracted to beat poetry and all that kind of stuff. William Blake he means freedom.
And they represented a better way of living than my parents did.
Yeah, and it's just funny. I mean, I probably had that same idea when I was in college or in my early 20s, and then since having kids, I can't go back and read Allen Ginsberg. It just feels like a useless pile of garbage to me.
I just noticed we're out of time for this episode, Kyle. We'll keep going with this discussion next week and make this a two-parter. You can supplement this show by reading Kyle McCarthy's article or on the United Front Against Austerity website at againstausterity.org. The article is titled A World of Pure Imagination, How Occupy Turned to Anarchy. You've been listening to United Front Radio at